For a long time, I believed that grilling was the only part of hosting gatherings that I genuinely liked. It allowed me to remain outside, busy with my hands, and it gave me an excuse to avoid sitting too long in the type of conversations my wife's family loved, carefully polite discussions filled with subtle competition, where everyone quietly sized up everyone else. That evening was warm, and the smoke from the grill floated straight upward instead of blowing into my eyes. I had 6 steaks laid out for dinner, 1 for her parents, 1 for her sister and brother-in-law, 1 for my wife, and 1 for me. Earlier, I had seasoned them with salt and let them rest, just like a chef friend once advised. By the time the first steak touched the grill, her father had already uncorked a second bottle of wine. Through the kitchen window behind me, I could hear laughter drifting outside, the familiar pattern of their voices. I had never quite been part of that rhythm, but after years of marriage, it felt normal. Cooking was simply my role. When I flipped the steaks for the second time, I suddenly remembered that I had forgotten the peppercorn sauce sitting in the refrigerator. I placed the tongs down and stepped inside to grab it. The kitchen was empty. Down the hallway, the dining room lights were glowing, and a conversation from the table carried clearly enough to follow even though I hadn't meant to. Listen. I opened the refrigerator and reached toward the container. Her father's voice was the first one I recognized. "He's a good cook," he said. There was a brief pause. "But that man is dead weight. You need to leave him before he drags all of us down." The refrigerator light buzzed softly. I kept the door open. My wife responded almost right away, and the tone in her voice wasn't angry or defensive. It sounded practical, even. "Don't worry, Dad. The lawyer is filing on Monday." Another short pause followed. "He says we can take half of his company too." There are moments when your body expects you to react, drop something, speak up, make some kind of sound. But I didn't. I simply stood there, holding a plastic container of sauce while the faint clinking of silverware drifted in from the dining room. Her father asked something I couldn't quite make out. She answered again, more quietly this time. "It's structured under his name," she said, "but the lawyer says it still counts as marital property." The refrigerator light suddenly seemed too bright. Carefully, I closed the door. No one entered the kitchen. For a moment, I remained standing there, letting my mind catch up with what I had just heard. The betrayal itself wasn't the part that took time to process. That realization came quickly. What took longer to sink in was the understanding that this discussion clearly wasn't new. Monday. The lawyer, half the company. They had already planned everything. I looked down at the sauce container still in my hand, then toward the patio door leading outside. The steaks were still cooking. When I stepped back onto the patio, the grill hissed softly as fat dripped onto the heat. I picked up the tongs and flipped the first steak as if nothing had changed. In a way, nothing had. Not yet. Dinner itself went smoothly. Her mother praised the seasoning on the meat. Her sister asked how I prepared it and wanted the recipe. Her father politely asked one brief question about my work, which I answered with a short response. My wife barely looked in my direction. I suppose that made sense. If you're preparing to dismantle someone's life in 3 days, casual conversation probably feels unnecessary. After everyone left, the house grew unusually quiet. She went upstairs early. I stayed behind and cleaned the kitchen slowly, just as I always did after hosting dinner. Plates were stacked, grill utensils washed, leftover steak wrapped and placed in the refrigerator. By the time I finally sat down at the dining table, it was close to midnight. That was when the memories began surfacing, not dramatic moments, but small ones. Last winter, she had suddenly become curious about how the company was structured. She had asked questions about valuation that felt oddly specific. At one point, she even suggested simplifying some paperwork. At the time, I had assumed she was simply trying to support me. Now it looked far more like reconnaissance. I barely slept that night. Monday was only 3 days away. That detail kept repeating in my head. Monday. The following morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Daniel, the external legal counsel who had helped set up the company 7 years earlier, when it expanded beyond a 1-person operation. The second was to Mark, one of the board members who had invested during the early days and insisted on governance. Protections I once thought were unnecessary. Neither conversation involved emotions. It was mostly about documents, agreements, and ownership structures that had seemed overly complex when they were originally created. One particular clause kept coming up. The company's controlling shares were not personally held the way most people assumed. Instead, they were secured within a trust connected to the board's governance agreement. Back then, the arrangement had been designed to shield the company from external pressure. I hadn't given it much thought since. Daniel reviewed everything throughout the weekend. By Monday morning, before my wife's attorney had even contacted me, the company's legal team had already distributed confirmation documents to the board. They reaffirmed the existing share structure and the control protections already written into the company charter. Nothing dramatic happened, just paperwork moving exactly the way it was supposed to. Around noon that day, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I let it go to voicemail. About an hour later, Daniel called me. "They've reached out to us," he said. "Her lawyer?" I asked. "Yes." He paused briefly. "They appear to believe your controlling stake qualifies as marital property." Another short pause followed. I explained the structure. I didn't ask for details. I could easily imagine how the conversation had gone. Corporate law tends to remain very calm when it quietly shuts doors. Wednesday morning was when the phone calls started coming in. First my wife, then her father, then the lawyer again. By lunchtime, I had 50 missed calls. The voicemails sounded very different from the confident conversation I had overheard during dinner. Now there was confusion, less certainty. One message from her father simply said, "We need to talk." Another from the lawyer asked if I could help clarify certain documents. None of the messages included an apology. That part didn't surprise me. Late that afternoon, I finally listened to the first voicemail from my wife. She sounded exhausted. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about how the company is structured," she said. There was a long pause before she added softly, "Can you call me back?" I didn't return the call. Instead, I forwarded everything to Daniel and allowed him to manage the responses. Eventually, the divorce moved forward, as these things usually do. But the part they had planned, the quiet removal of half the company, never actually existed beyond their lawyer's assumption. The business remained exactly where it had always been. The board's governance structure held firm. And that evening, when I grilled steaks for her entire family, slowly changed in my memory. It wasn't the night everything exploded. It was the night everything silently became something else entirely.